Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you today. Matteo, I would really want to hear your views on what do we mean by reshoring first?
Well, thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here. Reshoring is typically defined as corporate decisions that companies take regarding the home country's partial or total relocation of their production, typically to serve local or regional or global demands. So typically reshoring is something that happens after companies decided to offshore part of their activities in other countries, often for looking for lower manufacturing costs, for example, or to access specific resources. But for some reasons, companies then decide that they want to move back activities, typically back to their home country, or to have a strong relocation of that activity. Reshoring is quite not really a new phenomenon. It started happening significantly in the last 10 years at least, but we have seen quite a growth in the number of cases of companies doing this process. Sometimes we refer to reshoring as backshoring, meaning that they typically shore back home. Sometimes they refer just to nearshoring, meaning that you just take things closer and not really in your home country. But all these elements are typically referred to what we call reshoring of manufacturing activities.
Thanks a lot, Matteo. I understood that some studies have been initiated in Europe in order to understand better the reshoring decisions. Could you give us some understanding about these studies?
Yes, when the phenomenon of reshoring became wider and wider, emerged very clearly that there were some issues in understanding really the phenomenon. The first reason was that there is no official data collection about reshoring, meaning that there are no institutional bodies tracking this phenomenon systematically. So there are no statistics, let's say, at least officially, in Europe at least. Also, it's difficult to track this phenomenon because companies sometimes don't like to share a lot of information about this kind of process because they think it's a strategic decision, so they want to keep it for themselves. And sometimes I think that they believe that it may be perceived as a managerial mistake, meaning, oh, I offshored, I made a bad decision, and then I'm coming back. But there are several projects going on concerning this phenomenon. I'd like to maybe mention some of the most known one. For example, there is a project called Makers Rise, which is an EU project that has different research streams related to manufacturing, and there is one specific on reshoring, based on a multinational group looking at what is happening in Europe. There are a couple of other interesting reshoring projects taking part in the northern part of Europe, mainly in Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, looking at what companies there are doing. Another interesting project is the European Manufacturing Survey, which is, again, a EU project that has mapped the decisions in manufacturing of several thousands of European companies, and they have a specific focus also on reshoring. Also, the European Reshoring Monitor is an interesting initiative. It's an observatory on Europe. Very interesting because they have been working mainly using news data collection, so collecting news coming from any source possible, and that's an interesting way to collect this data. So let's say that there are some projects going on, very well structured and developed, trying to make a little bit understanding of what the phenomenon is taking place.
Okay, thank you. So maybe going to the core questions, what really motivates company to reshore, relocate some of their activities?
Well, actually, this, I guess, it's probably the key question. So it's the key question for companies that some would like to understand why they should do it. It is a key question also for those that look and research this topic. Typically, there are three main strategic orientations that companies refer to when they need or when they want to reshore. The first one is what we call market seeking. So sometimes companies decide to reshore because the market requires them to do that, because they need to get closer to their market, or the market somehow asks them to do that. We can encompass here phenomena like the made-in effect, for example, or the specific access to the market, or some perception by the market that making and manufacturing abroad is not a matter, maybe an issue of quality, or maybe an issue of sustainability, for example. Other companies do this because they are more efficiency seeking. Several companies discover that when they offshore, typically looking for efficiency in terms of cost. Indeed, some costs reduce, but many other costs tend to increase. For example, logistic costs, control costs, quality costs. And so some companies decided to reshore because if you do that properly, costs can be somehow saved. You can optimize your logistics activities. So these companies tend to look for efficiency from this perspective. A third typical orientation is what we call resource seeking. So companies that try to restore because they need to have access to specific resources that they have difficulties in finding in the location where they are. This is probably the more challenging of the strategic orientations among these three, because typically this is a problem that many companies face when they move for specific resources, but they don't get access easily to other complementary resources that they need. This is, for example, an interesting area where we discuss about the concept of reshoring readiness, so being ready to reshore. Obviously, a key issue is related to the management of the trade-offs among the different drivers, because you reshore, for example, to get access to specific competences. On the other side, you lose maybe in benefit of lower costs. So you have to renounce a little bit the positive effects in terms of cost in order to get access to something else. Or again, you may have, by reshoring, a reduction in logistics costs or in the complexity and the risk of your supply chain. But on the other side, you lose the access to a foreign market, which was potentially interesting. Today, I would say that most of the discussion is around what companies do this, mainly by looking also at elements like innovation and sustainability, and in particular, how these two topics interplay with efficiency. So to which extent companies can still be competitive on the market, but try to use reshoring as an innovation tool and a sustainability perspective. I would say that today the real issue is not only understanding whether you should do it or not, but also how to do it if you decide to do that thing. I would say that the key question that the companies address from this point of view is whether to do the right thing, so whether to reshore or not, so which is the right thing to do. But the second problem is that when you have taken this decision, the real problem is do that thing right. So do that thing in a proper way. And our research shows that, oddly enough, it's more important to do that thing right rather than take the strategic decision properly. The big challenge is take a decision that you think, that you believe is the right one, and then do it well. Hopefully this is going to solve your problems, or at least make you a little bit more competitive.
Thank you. And what do you see as the role for procurement here? Any difference with going to a new country?
Well, actually, most of the discussion about reshoring is about reshoring of manufacturing. However, I would say that attention is given also to reshoring of procurement, meaning revising the procurement strategy, typically in favor to local procurement. I would say that the key role in procurement, first of all, is linking the reshoring decision to managing a local versus global supply network, meaning that when you move things, closer to your country or your home country, then you still need to manage supply, and maybe you need to revise also your supply strategy. And often the two things cannot be considered as separate decisions. Also, it's fundamental that procurement is involved in evaluating the impact of the supply network on the supply network of a reshoring decision. Let's say that I would say that today we indeed need to talk about transnational supply networks, not really international, national, but transnational is the key point. And also I would suggest that procurement is fundamental in evaluating the reshoring readiness. So the availability of competences and the availability of complementary resources and the complexity in getting access to this. Some cases that we have been studying showed that some reshoring decisions failed because procurement was somehow involved not in the right moment, considering that essentially procurement was not going to be a problem. And most of the cases, then the real issue was then finding the right suppliers locally, because maybe the supplier that you had, the global operator, was not really interesting or not available to support you in this operation. As a matter of fact, my perception is that sometimes the wrong idea is reshoring is a top-down strategic decision, and it involves mainly manufacturing, when that's not true. That's indeed also a procurement element, a procurement decision. In particular, the evaluation, for example, of the total cost of ownership of such a decision is something that procurement is really fundamental with. There are a couple of interesting initiatives that, for example, provide total cost of ownership tools really to evaluate these decisions, and it's very evident from these applications that procurement is something that is fundamental to do a proper evaluation.
Thank you. And you said it's not something new, but how is, the COVID epidemic impacting on reshoring? And what do you see as the future coming?
Well, I would say that when the epidemic started, several people started to think that this would have pushed dramatically reshoring, companies to reshore. So some expectations were that the epidemic would have pushed many companies to reshore and take back things back to their home country. I'm not really convinced that things will go exactly this way. What I'm convinced is that if companies were not really believing that they were living in a global supply chain context, now it's really clear that they are. So even if you were operating in a local market with mainly local supplier, now it's very clear that you operate in a global supply chain context. So I would say that COVID epidemic had shown the fragility of global networks, and at least has stimulated a critical thinking about manufacturing supply location decisions. So I'm not really saying that companies now are pushing reshoring back. We've seen cases of companies that decided to do that mainly because COVID convinced them that they need to move back things. But what I think is really happening is that companies are really thinking again about their manufacturing and supply location decisions. This happens at company level, so each company is looking at this from their own specific perspective. I perceive that this is also happening at industry level. Industries are now thinking about the problem of industry competitiveness, in particular for the industrial ecosystem. So starting to think that it's not really important that you are local or global if your key suppliers are not really close to what you're doing. So we are seeing, what I see more frequently are companies that are pushing their suppliers to invest locally, at least to have a guarantee that that suppliers are available, even if strange things may happen. This kind of discussion also happens at country level, obviously, because it's, well, reshoring is typically perceived as something that may generate competitiveness. And now there's quite a discussion about the fact of keeping control at country level of some critical assets and some critical supply chains. What still I don't see that much, and I think it's really a challenge, is also to take this discussion at multi-country level. Because I don't think it's feasible to relocate entire supply chains within one home country, so take everything back. What can be more feasible is to foster country agreements to develop strategic European supply chains, at least. So that's at least the European focus. So I think that that is a key point. The last thing is probably that COVID has accelerated an evolution in the Eastern market, in particular in the China's role in the global manufacturing competition. China was perceived as the world production facility, so where all manufacturing was doing. Now I think that this epidemic has clearly shown that China is going closer to an independent economy. So they are moving towards the key controllable stage of economy, from raw materials to final market. So leading us as a Europe to rethink a little bit our location strategy, also coherently with our competitive strategy.